Welcome back to the Blue Chip Academy podcast. Empower the next generation of leaders by equipping them with a detailed blueprint to success while using sports as our catalyst. Today, we get an inside look at the supply chain talent acquisition of big-time college football with Penn State General Manager Andy Frank. Man, welcome on.
Justin, thanks for having me, man. It's good stuff.
Oh, man, appreciate it, man. Thanks for taking the time out, man. It's a busy time in the recruiting season. You got transfer portal, you got the second signing day coming up, all that good stuff. But as a prime decision maker at a Power 5 university, I mean, this is a stat that I think has been getting overshadowed a little bit. But out of the last 7 years, you guys have won 11 games. We've won 11 games in 4 of those 7 seasons. You've seen that. Man, that's crazy to say out loud. Like if we just take that in a little bit, 11 wins over the past 4 times over the past 7 years. It's hard to win college football games, and that's a credit to you guys, both on and off the field. So jumping into that, you've seen the gumbo prepare for a while. What do you think the main ingredient to that success is, both on and off the field, to have that type of success?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's people, and you got to have great people in the organization. That typically starts from the top and kind of makes its way throughout the organization, from a staff perspective, obviously, but then players. You got to have. I think we all know that this is a talent business in terms of talent acquisition and having the guys on the field that can play the game at the level you want. But part of that is having good people all the way through the organization, and you typically get the most out of people when the people are around them are quality people and are good at what they do, are talented in their own rights. I don't think that there's any necessarily one way of being successful. I think there's lots of different ways. There's people that, as far as leaders, that are very hands-on. There's those that are hands-off, but ultimately you've got to have good qualified people, from staff to players, and everybody's got to be pulling that rope in the same direction. Everybody's got to understand what direction you're pulling that rope and why you're pulling at the rope. I think that's something that today is maybe more important than ever, is people understanding why the organization approaches things a certain direction, and so everybody can kind of be all on the same page and in it together. And I think we've had a great run. One of the things that's great about working here is you are around good people, and the good players, as far as talent wise, is one thing, but it's amazing to get around our guys and just the type of people they are. It makes coming to work a lot of fun.
Most definitely. That's a great answer too, because even when we think about, you say, like, both on and off the field, just understanding that football operations or just a football organization is a machine. I think a lot of people lose sight of that. They just see maybe the coaches, the head coach and the 9 or 10 other coaches. We recognize there's like another 60 people, 70 people that are working on a constant basis to make the boat run at the end of the day. And especially with, we talk about like the talent that's come through there, but also the coaches, assistant coaches that have gone there and kind of sprungboard their careers, whether head coaches, Huff, you got Joe Moorhead getting his bounce back to is another head coach, Ricky Ronnie. I mean, the list continues to go. Coach Fessler kind of comes through that aspect as once a walk-on. So yeah, so full spectrum of people, both on and off the field, just understanding that piece of building a full organization. So get into the background a little bit, man. You speak about like where you're from and like how'd you get into football?
Yeah, so I grew up just north of Detroit. Went to a high school in Sterling Heights, a school called Stevenson High School there. Had a really good, football experience and sports experience. I was in sports all the way growing up. Played soccer initially. I wasn't somebody who played football when I was 5. Parents didn't let me play until I was in middle school, so 7th grade was the first time I played football. But played all sports, baseball, played basketball. Eventually got to the point in high school where I couldn't dribble with my left or shoot, so basketball was done for me, but was around sports. My dad was a high school swim coach, so I was around it a bunch growing up. Played football all the way through high school, ran track all the way through high school. Like I said, gave up basketball because I wasn't as good at it. But then went on to Princeton and played 4 years there. Was not a great player, but still loved it and made it something that was a big part of my college experience, and found a way to be a contributor, even though I probably wasn't the best player on the team by any stretch, but found my role on special teams and enjoyed that, and was helped the team in that regard. After school, once I finished college, I went back to Michigan and was basically working for an engineering firm. And that was a good experience. It was around a lot of great people, learned a lot with it. And when I was doing it, my cousin at the time was coaching high school ball at Warren Lincoln, where he went to school, and actually where my dad went to school. And he asked me, hey, you want to just come out and help us, coach DBs a little bit? I said, sure. It was JV football. I'd leave work a little bit early. My boss let me do it, which was awesome. Went down there and coached and loved it. The next year, I kind of worked a deal out with my boss at the engineering firm. Hey, I'm going to leave every day at about 2:30. Is that okay? Come in a little bit early. They were great about it. And so I did that for the 4 years, and then was looking around to try and I kind of knew the engineering thing probably wasn't the long term for me. I enjoyed the company. I enjoyed a lot of things about the work, but I wasn't passionate about it. And really it came down to everybody's different, but I would leave work and not think about it until I was driving in the next day. And that wasn't me. That wasn't something that, interested me as far as a career. And at work, I found myself thinking about the football piece of things. So it was actually kind of funny. My college coach was in town. We had some type of gathering and just started kind of picking his brain about, hey, if I wanted to get back into this at a higher level, what should I do? And so he said, hey, you could become a graduate assistant. And I said, that sounds interesting. He said, well, I kind of asked him, how do you get into it? I don't know anybody. I know you and a few other coaches, but I don't really know anybody. Right. So he just said, hey, if you can get a GA job, that's a great way in. They're really hard to get, and they're probably harder to get in a lot of cases at bigger schools because they've got more players that are, interested, and they're going to go with their former player. So he said, hey, try and find a few schools that are maybe a little bit harder to get into school-wise for grad school, and apply to those schools and then reach out to those coaches. And so I did that, and kind of the connections piece, and sometimes you don't know where they're at. I called Vanderbilt and talked to the director of football operations and actually left a message. It's kind of a funny story. So he calls me back and he says, 586, where are you from? And my area code, I said, well, I'm from Detroit. And he said, whereabouts? I said, well, a city just north of Detroit called Sterling Heights. He's like, whereabouts? And I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. I'm like, I grew up at 17 Mile in Ryan. He's like, you're not going to believe this, but I grew up at 15 in Ryan. And so, kind of talking a little bit further, and he's talking about his family. I'm talking about my family, and I'm like, yeah, my dad was a Sterling Heights police officer. He's like, are you pulling my leg? Because my two brothers work for the police department. And I was like, this is wild. So, kind of that was the connection. Didn't know him, but then kind of, he was like, hey, I don't have anything available for you right now, but thanks for calling, type of deal. And I called him back, a few weeks later. I said, hey, you got some summer camps? Could I come down and work them? And went down and worked those camps, and they were getting ready to promote their GA to an off the field role at the time, and said, hey, you want to come back down and interview? And I did, and was fortunate to get it, and that's kind of how I got into it there. GA'd at Vanderbilt for 3 years, and then again was fortunate again when I finished my GA job. I really didn't find what I was looking for from a coaching perspective, and I did want to coach, and there's still probably a little bug in me there to coach. In fact, I missed that a little bit, but they ended up creating a job for me in an off-the-field role, and was fortunate to do that. Spent, I want to say, 3 months or so where I was unemployed until the job actually got created. And in that 3 months, I actually did a pretty cool, recruiting project, and was just, coming to the office every day, working for free. And the job that was kind of an operations recruiting type of job morphed itself into a recruiting job. There wasn't a recruiting person there at the time, and it kind of developed into that.
So when you started that recruiting project, after you wanted to become a coach, did you fall in love with the recruiting operations aspect during that time, like the time that you were unemployed?
Yeah, I did, and it was interesting because it fits me in terms of my personality. Okay. It was maps and different things along those lines, and different diagrams and all those things, and trying to figure out where should, at the time it was Vanderbilt, where should Vanderbilt recruit to get the most bang for our buck? And that was, was challenging and interesting, and there was no right answer, but there was better answers than maybe what we were doing at the time. And I really I enjoyed it and kind of fell in love with it, and have never really kind of looked back.
Well, man, that's a crazy entry point into the whole football space, because at that time, James isn't the head coach, right?
No, Bobby Johnson was the head coach at the time, and worked for a great staff there. Had some success, obviously not enough success, but it was at the time. It was. I mean, I got there in '05. This was probably 2008 maybe. Um, there weren't many. Now we've got a recruiting staff of, I want to say, 12 people or something like that. At the time, you had an administrative assistant maybe that worked in recruiting, and you had an on-field coach. The rules actually required an on-field coach to be the recruiting coordinator.
Oh
And
man.
so thinking about that today is almost comical, but I'm not saying Vanderbilt was the first person or I was the first person, but that was about the era when these positions started getting created, and that kind of just took off from there.
No, most definitely. And for the listeners, I don't know if you guys know, if there's a coaching transition, a lot of times in sports in general, like they clean house and bring in their own people. So can we go into a little bit about how you end up being retained by James to continue to go into recruiting? Because like I think that's a step in the story that's just, I mean, that's rare for most people when they're at a program and they clean house.
Yeah, so like you said, a lot of times a new coach comes in, the people that are there before, unfortunately get let go, and you understand why. Um, I enjoyed Vanderbilt, I enjoyed Nashville, so I had every intentions of trying to stay. So the positive of being, particularly back then when there was only one or two recruiting people, and I was overseeing recruiting at the time, is you have a lot of knowledge that a new coach needs when they come in. So you're put right in front of that person, and you're probably at the timing of the year, because it's typically a coaching change happens sometime around December. They're finishing up. Signing day was a little bit different back then, timing wise, but they're racing to signing day to try and finish the class, and you've got a lot of the information, which is helpful. You're also not a coach, and a lot of times coaches know a lot more coaches, so they've got their corners coach picked out, they've got their running backs coach picked out. And particularly in coach's case, he wasn't coming from being a head coach, so he didn't necessarily have a recruiting person that was his guy. So I think it gave me an opportunity. And then the other things I think you got to be smart about. I reached out to people that I knew, that knew Coach Franklin, and one of them was Charles Huff. And it's interesting; it goes back to the connections, and I think connections are really important. Ultimately, the connection allows you to prove yourself in a way. I think sometimes people think that connections are to just get you the job. I don't really believe in that so much.
That's a good point. That's a great point.
But it's funny. Charles Huff was at TSU back in the day. He's now the head coach at Marshall, and we were coming back from a coaches convention, and I think we were at the airport together, flying back into Nashville, and we just started talking. And so he and I kind of got to be fairly close at the time. He was either on Maryland staff at the time when Coach was coming from there, or I knew he had been, so I called him up and said, "Hey, okay, what do I need to know?" And so he gave me some pretty good tips, and it's funny because those tips, having been around Coach now for as long as I have, 12 plus years, whatever it is,
Yeah.
they still hold true. They're things that he values, and so I knew going in, hey, I'm going to prepare myself to put myself in the best position with not only what any head coach would probably want or need, but in particular, how Coach Franklin views things. So I had books prepared for him and that type of deal, because I knew he'd want something tangible. He wanted to be able to see it. Those things were important to him, not just talking to him about it, but seeing it. And so worked in myself and Michael Hazel, who was there at the time, were really the only two, other than a couple of administrative assistants, the only two like people that stayed. I think one coach as well, and I think a lot of that had to do with knowing a little bit about Coach ahead of time, but then also being in a position when it came to the recruiting to be on that job interview for a month and a half or whatever it was. And I'll say the other thing I think Coach did a great job of back then. I could be a little bit off on my timing, but I feel like he brought us in right before Christmas time and said, "Hey, I'm not retaining you. I'm hiring you for this job." And I thought that was something that stuck with myself, and it was also to go home for Christmas and know, hey, I'm in a spot that's a little different than going home for Christmas, and you don't know, am I going to get called while I'm at home celebrating
That's a
and not
tough
coming
Christmas
back?
Eve.
So that was really good, and so I think you obviously fortunate again, but and then I've have a chance to be with Coach ever since.
No, that's a cool story. And if you could just, for people to understand, like showing your value to a head coach or a coach that's coming in, you do have to understand and get externally focused to see like, all right, where does my value fit with this person? Can you tell us a little bit about what it was, things that James valued that you showed him? Because I always tell the stories that I work in at Penn State for the first point in like the football space. Like it was just it was like professional development or career development, top level, right? Where you can go and it's like, all right, if I'm turning anything in, it has to look this way, or this is going to get checked, and has to be that. And so I appreciate it now. You know what I mean? So could you tell me a little bit about those value
Absolutely,
points?
and I think that's an interesting thing. And if you look at the GAs that have come through and worked for Coach Franklin, you got Joe Brady, you've got a bunch of guys, you got Andrew Jackson who's coaching D line now at West Virginia. There's a bunch of guys that have gone on to bigger and better things from that kind of training ground. And that's really for everybody. And I think Coach has a standard, and that standard is non-negotiable, and it's all the time. And it's really impressive, his ability to hold you to it and hold you to it always, in a way that you can understand and be like, oh, I get why he wants it this way. I think that's something from a training standpoint. The details, I mentioned I had a kind of a recruiting book that I gave when he came in. It had a cover with a picture on it. Does the picture matter? Maybe it doesn't really truly matter, but the image of it does. Is it detailed? I use an example. Like we've got interns, and one of my pet peeves is people who can't hole punch. It sounds silly, but you get people who use a hole puncher, and it's like they hole punch it two different ways, and now it doesn't fit in the binder. Like things like that are things that when you work for Coach, there's an expectation that it's going to be done. I don't want to say perfect, but it's going to be done to a certain level. It's funny because I may be making this story up, but we were sitting in our staff room there when Coach had first got there, and we had board tags back then, and you kind of had like a plastic tag, and inside the plastic tag was a piece of paper with the prospect. And you'd put them up on the board, and you kind of put them around, and Coach had kind of moved one around, and I was there, and I think I'll tell the story as it's true. I'm not sure it is really true, but he had one up there. It was just a little crooked, and I kind of went behind him, and I tilted it to be perfectly straight, and he's like, yeah, I think that was the moment I knew I'm probably gonna hire this guy, before, because it was like one of those things like, hey, it bothered me that it wasn't straight, and that's the type of detail and little things that you need it to win at the highest levels. Because it's interesting when you get to the top tier of college football, people start to think, oh, it's easy. No, not really. The margin for error just gets smaller. Yeah, as you get higher up and you've got better talent, let's just say, than maybe some of the teams you might play. But eventually, if you want to get where you need to get to, that margin for error keeps getting smaller. So I think that was, a big thing in the process. Fortunately for me, in terms of working for Coach, I was already pretty detailed and pretty, I don't know, what the ADHD, not ADHD, but more kind of hypersensitive to
like
things.
OCD a little bit about like this needs to be this way.
Yeah,
like,
so that was big for me. I think the other thing too, in terms of impressing coaches in particular, I'll go back, and we had that first recruiting cycle before Coach Franklin got hired. The way that college rules work, you only have, at the time I think it was actually 9 assistant coaches and 1 head coach. Only those people could go on the road recruiting to evaluate kids. Well, you have a coaching change. A bunch of coaches are gone. They put the people that were in the office on the road recruiting. So I had gone on the road recruiting for a couple weeks while we did not have a head coach. And I was fortunate enough, I went and watched a state championship game of a kid named Joe Townsend, who was a local Nashville area product. He had come to our camp a bunch and all those things. And so we kind of got down to the end of the recruiting cycle. And Joe, we had kind of a group of guys that were kind of O-lineman, D-lineman type of guys that we were trying to decide, hey, we're going down to our last scholarship or two. Who do we want to take? And the board kind of kept dwindling away. And Joe was my guy. And I kind of, from the beginning, I was just like, hey, I've seen this kid. I just know he's going to be, I don't know if he's going to be an All-American, but I know this kid can play for us. I've seen enough. He does enough different things. No player is perfect, but I was confident in that. And so for a first staff, it kind of just, my rankings was different than other people because I had the more information than they did. Maybe they were the new staff was just looking at film, and I had a little more information, and so it kind of just kept ticking away, and it finally got to the point where he was the take that was there. He was committed to Middle Tennessee State at the time, and I was like, guys, we need to take this guy. We need to take this guy. Fortunately for me, he came there and became a good player. It was a 3+ year starter for us at center, and was a really good player. So I think that's another way that I've been in it long enough. I've been wrong lots on prospects, but I think having that one as a starting point to impress the new head coach was helpful because the kid got here. He was Coach Franklin's type of kid. The way he worked, the way he went about his business, and then he had success.
That's a great point because as in personnel or just being that value add to the head coach, like you have to come with a different perspective, and that different perspective has to produce the results that we all want. That is universal, right? So like that's a great point. And now we're jumping into now your time as the general manager at Penn State. You tell just the listeners that they don't understand what the general manager does at a football program, like your responsibilities and duties?
Yeah, I joke about this sometimes. I don't know sometimes if I understand what it is. It's, I think every place does it a little bit differently. For us here, I oversee the recruiting department and try to make sure that we're structured the way that is most efficient for the organization. Try to make sure that, the people in the recruiting department are allowed to be in positions that provide the opportunity for them to be successful with who they are, how they work, how they operate. I do a lot of things in terms of I'm our liaison to a number of different places. Compliance office is one of them. Try to make sure that we as a football staff always understand what's going on out there. Do a lot of stuff when it comes to roster management, in terms of, ultimately at the college football level, the head football coach is, if we think about NFL, is the GM. I've got the title, but the head coach makes the final decisions. We all know that, but try and provide input there in terms of our roster, how many guys we need at each position. For me right now, I wish I was watching more film than I do, but I do, I make it an effort to, as things get further in the process and a kid becomes, hey, this kid might really commit to us. You got to watch that film. You got to know. You got to have an opinion on those kids. Do I watch a bunch of kids before we offer them? I don't. We've got a lot of people on staff that do that and do a great job of it. But being able to add that perspective, because I think the other thing that's interesting, as far as never been in the NFL, as far as a worker or a player, but at the college level, you get different perspectives. Whatever seat you sit in, I've been around, a bunch of different coaches, and they sit in a certain seat. And no matter who the person is in the seat, they see things through that lens. And because of who they are and their life experiences and their abilities, they might see it a little bit differently. But a coach has a certain perspective. A recruiting staff member has a certain perspective. I think the thing that's interesting about my role is I don't do this because I'm trying to agree with the head coach, but I probably view things through a lens more similar to his than most people on staff.
Gotcha.
Just because for me, whether the offensive player, I don't have an allegiance to an offensive player or a defensive player. I don't have an allegiance to a special teams player. As a position coach, you've got an allegiance to your room, and you should, and you absolutely should. And you're going to have, as you get down, and I'll joke sometimes, or people will joke me sometimes, I try to view it from 30,000 feet. I might not know the nitty-gritty details, but I can see how that one thing, that house down there might impact the other house, across the way. Whereas if you're a coach, you may see the nitty-gritty details, but you might not realize what's going on somewhere else, as far as the numbers and those things. So try to provide that perspective to the staff and to Coach Franklin, obviously, as he ultimately has to make the decisions.
That's a great point, even just to say that you view it like the head coach, because I think that's the number one job of the recruiting and personnel department, is to kind of be the holders of the program, right? Because I joke around with assistant coaches, like they're all independent contractors. Everybody is out working for themselves. Like someone has to protect the house regardless of how things move, even when we're talking about building staffs off the field or on the field, or just keeping the same identity when we're evaluating players. Because you're talking 11 different personalities that have to coach a certain position, that have the same say in the evaluation process and all those different things. So already recruiting and personnel is a lot more dynamic in college than it is in the NFL. I remember just dealing with my friends in the NFL or different guys in personnel, and I'm like, yeah, we watch about 700-800 guys a year. They're like, what? Like, we watch like 150, 200. Like, there's not that. You know who's coming out of school. You know who might be coming out. We don't have to pay attention to them because it's a 3 month, but we're evaluating and recruiting for 3 years to get one player. So just all the details that go into that. Now we throw in NIL to the mix. How is the NIL process or just the new rule change with that and transfer portal change the recruiting process for you?
Yeah, obviously new rules result in having to come up with new plans. You go about your business with a certain set of rules for a long time, and you start to kind of hone in on how you want to go about it, what you believe in, what you think works for you and your program, and what doesn't work. With the transfer portal becoming obviously very prevalent, and then NIL becoming a big deal as well, we're all out here trying to adjust. And the reality is there isn't a blueprint for it, and there isn't someone who you can necessarily go to like, hey, you've worked in this industry for 10 years. How do you do this? If and I kind of say that sometimes too about like the role that I sit in and kind of when I got started, we were making it up as we went along. The off-field recruiting position, those of us that were in it fairly early on, they were new jobs. You were making it up as you go along. Whereas if you're a defensive coordinator, there's been defensive coordinators coaching football for a long, long, long time. And I'm not saying it's the same. It's changed a bunch. But you learned from that person. And you learned, you were a corners coach first, and then, or you were a GA first, let's just say, and then you were a corners coach, and then you were a coordinator. But all the way through the process, you were watching someone do that job before you got it. So going back to the recruiting rules, you didn't have that. You were kind of making it up as you went along. I think the same thing is true now for NIL and for the transfer portal. The whole industry and it sounds bad, but we're making it up as we go along. We're trying to figure out what's going to work for us. And what's going to work for us here at Penn State may not work for somebody else, either where they're located geography-wise, where they're located from a conference standpoint, resource standpoint. So you really have to, best practices, you're trying to figure out, okay, what is everybody else doing? Why are they maybe doing it that way? What of that could apply to us? What doesn't apply to us? And I think that's something that we're all really trying to do. It's hard because it is crazy, and you talk about the dynamic nature of college football and recruiting. That makes it hard. It adds a whole nother recipe to it. It also is fun because it's a new challenge. It's it's painful along the way because you're going to make mistakes, but the people that get it the most right are going to be the people that have the most success. And when I say the most right for them, because it legitimately is going to be different everywhere. So I do enjoy it. I do hope that we get to a day where it does settle down and it does become more evened out. You mentioned again, like the dynamic part about the college versus NFL. One thing I don't think people take into account is in college, there is a calendar and there is a year-by-year timeline, but that year-by-year timeline is essentially different for every prospect you recruit. Yes, they sign on signing day, and that's the majority of them. But when they actually decide is different for every single kid. So if you're an NFL scout, and there's tons of challenges in being an NFL scout. Again, the margin of error is probably even small. It's definitely smaller for being an NFL scout. But hey, this is the Senior Bowl. This is the Combine. This is when we have to draft them. And so they can have a process of how they go about their evaluation all the way through. For us, we got to be ready to say yes or no to a kid at a moment's notice. And I think going back to the transfer portal piece of this, you really found it this year with the transfer portal window. And I know there are a lot of coaches out there that wanted a window of time where it was smaller. I would have preferred, and I think we would have preferred it to be an open-ended window, because the way it's set up right now, everybody goes in, whatever, 1,500, 1,800, whatever it ended up being. Everybody goes in a month and a half period. You can make all of those decisions like that. And so to me, if a kid wants to go in before that, it makes it so it's a maybe a little more spread out pace of, and maybe a calmer pace of making decisions as opposed to the frantic. Okay, we got to decide. We got to get this kid's transcript. Then we got to get the syllabi for the class to see if they're going to transfer in. Now we got to get him to apply to school. The kid hasn't picked you yet, but you're trying to get him to apply to school, and the kid looks at you like you're crazy. It's like, I don't even know if I'm coming to Penn State yet. Why do I need to apply to school? It's like, well, we're going to go to Christmas here, and we're not going to have as many people working. Yeah, you get people to work over the holiday, and that's a huge help. But like all of those things, it just becomes a race that you don't know if you're going to get to the finish line in time for.
Most definitely. I mean, like you said, there's so many different aspects just getting into a school, right? Just make sure they do their normal application, or when the actual offer letter goes out, and just the different offers that go, like, yeah, the building of the relationship, the continuous evaluation after the offer. Like the recruiting process is so dynamic that it gets these guys, I feel like, an opportunity to just get ready for the real world, to be completely honest. And now when you bring the monetary value up with NIL and different things of that nature, I mean, the experience is right there at the forefront. Have you seen any athletes? I mean, I know when I was recruiting, or we were doing the thing, you could tell which some guys that had a good grips on the recruiting process. They had they knew what they were looking for. They handled themselves in a certain type of way. Have you seen any common practices amongst people that have been handled in NIL recruiting era a certain type of way?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, the kids and their high school coaches and the people around them, they're going through it for the first time as well right now. So they're trying to figure it out just from their perspective, just like we're trying to figure it out from our perspective. Ultimately, most kids that go on to play college, and then ultimately from college to the NFL, it's a one-time process for them and their family, and it's always kind of been that way. It's been I've been through this many cycles now. I know how it typically goes, but a family might not know that, and so they're learning it. But what's happened over time is they have a high school coach, or they've got somebody else in their area that has seen it before and has been able to help guide them through the process. Hey, you should not just go to one school. You should take multiple visits. Hey, don't just go on an official visit and think the place is the greatest place on the earth, because essentially they know what they're doing. When you come on an official visit here, we've done this before. We can make any place look good, and so they've had that support system. I think now what's going on is that those support systems are trying to figure out the best ways to do things. I'll start with the ways that I think people and prospects maybe aren't going about it the right way.
Okay.
And this is for everybody's, what they value and what they're looking for in a college experience is different. So a little bit of this might be just my own personal opinion. But I think ultimately at Penn State, and I'm guessing at most other schools, you want the player and the student to be able to make as much money as they possibly can make. I don't think any of us now, I think there's maybe a perception out there by some that, oh, you don't want the player to make money. I hope all our guys make a ton of money. I really do. But in the process, I think you have to, when you go through the process, you have to separate that out. And what we found is, at least in the first year or two of this, the kids are probably doing a better job of that, separating it out and looking for what probably matters more than in some cases the parents, and in some cases the people around them, because it's new, it's the new thing to talk about. It becomes the main driving force for some people. As opposed to what's the right school for me, what's the right coaching staff for me, and then ultimately, hey, if the right school and the right coaching staff, the opportunity for money, let's just make up fake numbers right now. Let's say it's at that right place. It feels right. I like the players on the team. I like the coaches. I like the school. It's got my major. All of those things. If that opportunity is, let's just say $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
And then another school that you like a little bit less, but not quite as much. I like the coaches, pretty good. they're off. I don't say offering, but they've got an opportunity for you to make $5 million a year. I don't think anybody's going to begrudge a kid in a family who picks the second option there. Where I think people are making some mistakes is the numbers aren't life-changing numbers, but the college experience can be a life-changing experience. And it should be a life-changing experience really for anybody who goes to college. If you do it the right way, and really if you do it the wrong way, one way or the other, it's going to be life-changing. So go the way that's going to be, the positive life-changing. And yes, money absolutely matters, but don't get caught up in short-term money that's in reality not changing yours or anybody else's life, when that education, the people you're around, can change your life. So the people I'd say they've done it the wrong way are the people that are so focused on what's the dollar amount, and they lose sight of trying to determine all the other things. The people that have seen it and do it the right way, they don't worry about that money piece until the end, and they're comparing their top schools. Hey, I'm down to these 3, 4. I like all of them. What's going to differentiate this one over that one? If money is dramatically different based on what you think the current teams are making at both places, then yes, use it as a maybe something you're going to consider, but don't have it close off opportunities to you. You see too many kids right now because there's so much talk about NIL. There's a lot of fake numbers out there that they get caught up in that. So that's something that I think regardless of what you all, and $1,000 to one person is very different than $1,000 to another person. And at the end of the day, you make your decision based on what that value is to you and your family. And I'm good with that, but keep your mind open to the other things as well. Don't shut them off, because if you do, I think that's where bad decisions get made.